I think you can see the fingerprints of lots of other writers in this book and others, the ones that get name checked and others as well, which in one funny way is quite a useful clue to the translator, regardless of what I do with particular quotations, which I can say something about in a moment. But it's interesting to discover what role Borges has in the story, or what happens when there's a reference to Jim Coetzee or whatever, what these people are doing in the story. When something is, when there is something actually quoted, something directly quoted in the translation, it depends slightly on the extent to which, first of all, it depends on whether it's something that was originally in English, and it depends on the extent to which it's something that has a sort of canonical English version. Quite often, Agualusa or other writers will quote someone whose original is English, and my job then is not to translate, but to find this wretched sentence from somewhere in a 600-page novel where every page has a line about memory and I can't find the one he's talking about. And so it's often the kind of last part of the puzzle is tracking down the actual quotation and dropping it in, because I'm not going to create my version of the Bruce Chatwin book, because Bruce Chatwin and his biographer Nicholas Shakespeare did, these things exist in English. One of the places this gets complicated is that if a writer is using a translation of a piece of English, there will always be some slight distortion. And as a result, the original text won't always fit into the place where it exists in the novel as a translation, if you see what I mean. Or to put it another way, writers do occasionally slightly misquote. And often what I find myself doing is, I find, this line from wherever it comes from and insert it into the right place. And I then have to rewrite, the 2 lines before it and the line afterwards to make this thing work, because it doesn't quite work. And there was an interesting case in one of the, in one of Agualusa's books, the very end of the book quotes Martin Luther King, I Had a Dream.
I remember that.
And the way it works in Portuguese doesn't quite work in English, but I couldn't change the quote in English because it's not like anyone's going to be fooled if I slightly misquote Martin Luther King Jr. and that, like, one of the most famous iconic lines of anything in the 20th century. And so it required a little bit of kind of massaging of the context in order to make the original quotation work in a way that the translated quotation works in the original novel. You see what I mean? It's slightly complicated. These things also happen, and what is rather more tricky is when these things happen quite deliberately, because, and I can't think of a case where Agualusa has done this, but I can think of a lot of writers who very deliberately misrepresent another text in their text. So they deliberately quote something slightly lying in a way that they can get away with because they're using it in a context where not everyone is going to know precisely where this comes from. And in English, if this is a line from one of the more famous lines from Shakespeare or a line from a speech or something, I'm slightly in trouble. I also, a few years ago, I translated a novel by a Mexican writer called Juan Pablo Villalobos, who's a lovely, very funny, brilliant writer. Yeah. And his book is full of little quotations from things. And I spent a lot of time trying to track down either the English, if it was an English original, or an English translation, if one existed, and so forth. And I finally came down to one that I couldn't find. And there's a moment in the novel where the narrator says, "Oh, it's a bit like that line in the Harrison Ford movie from the late 80s where he says, there's a scene when he's in a car park and he meets the guy and he says such and such." And I watched quite a lot of Harrison Ford movies from the late 80s, thinking, which one has a scene where he confronts someone in a car park? Because it could be almost anything. And I watched several movies. I remember this was during the first lockdown, finding things and watching them. And, there was one scene which was in a car park, but didn't seem to have any line like that. And finally, I wrote to him and said, I give up. Where did this line come from? And he said, oh, no, I made that one up. So the moral of the story is writers are terrible people. They're liars. They are heartless, evil people. But yes, the short version is the intention is sort of like any translation, is to find whatever the real thing is and use the real thing. But also the intention is to make something that works, which means often there's a little bit of maneuvering around it to try and massage things into place.